My fiance's father is forcing me to marry my fiance's twin brother. His marriage paid the price instead. My fiance Oliver and his twin brother Blake couldn't be more different. Oliver was kind, worked as a physical therapist, and treated me like an equal partner. Blake was 32 and still lived in his parents' basement, had been fired from 6 jobs for harassment, and spent his time making crude comments about every woman he met. When Oliver proposed after 3 years together, I was thrilled until his father, Robert, pulled me aside at our engagement party and said I was making a mistake choosing the wrong brother. He actually said those words to my face while Oliver was across the room, showing his mom the ring. Robert said Blake had more potential, just needed the right woman to fix him, and that I could be that woman. I laughed, thinking it was a weird joke, but Robert was serious. He said Oliver was too soft, too boring, that Blake had the real personality in the family. Blake, who had been arrested twice for bar fights. Blake, who'd been banned from Oliver's gym for taking photos of women without permission. Blake, who'd asked me at our first meeting if I had prettier friends. Robert started his campaign immediately. Every family dinner, he'd seat me next to Blake instead of Oliver. When I'd move, he'd make a scene about the seating chart being intentional for conversation flow. Blake would spend the meal making gross comments about my body while Robert laughed and said Blake was just confident. Oliver would tell his dad to stop, but Robert would say Oliver needed to learn to take a joke. For Oliver's birthday, Robert organized a surprise party, but told me the wrong time, so I arrived 2 hours late. When I got there, Blake was sitting in my spot next to Oliver, wearing my gift on his wrist, the watch I'd bought that Robert had apparently taken from my car and given to Blake to present. Robert told everyone Blake had picked it out and wasn't that thoughtful. Oliver knew immediately something was wrong, but Robert had already taken photos for the family album. The worst was when Robert invited me to lunch to discuss wedding planning. I arrived at the restaurant to find Blake there instead, wearing a suit and cologne that made my eyes water. Robert had told Blake this was a date I'd agreed to. Blake tried to kiss me, and I shoved him so hard he fell into a plant. Robert showed up an hour later claiming traffic and acted shocked that Blake had misunderstood the situation, but I'd seen his car in the parking lot the whole time. He'd been watching from across the street. Robert started telling family members that I seemed conflicted about which brother to marry. Oliver's aunt called him concerned because Robert said I'd been spending time with Blake. Oliver's grandmother asked why I was leading both brothers on. Robert had been poisoning the entire family against me while pushing Blake to pursue me aggressively. Blake started showing up at my work with flowers, telling my coworkers he was my boyfriend. Security had to remove him 3 times. Robert called my boss to apologize for the misunderstanding and said Blake was just confused about which twin I was marrying. My boss asked me if I was really marrying into this insane family. Oliver confronted Robert, but he denied everything, said Blake was acting on his own feelings, and couldn't help that he'd fallen for me. He said maybe it was a sign I'd chosen wrong. He actually suggested Oliver should step aside for his brother's happiness. Oliver told him to go to hell, and Robert said that proved Oliver didn't really love me if he wouldn't consider what was best for everyone. 2 weeks before the wedding, Robert made his biggest move. He called our venue and changed the groom's name on all the paperwork to Blake. He contacted the officiant and said there'd been a mix-up with the twins' names. He even reprinted programs with Blake's name. He planned to create enough confusion on the wedding day that I'd somehow accidentally marry Blake. He didn't know I'd put passwords on all our vendor accounts after the birthday watch incident. Everyone called me immediately about the changes. That's when Oliver and I decided to give Robert exactly what he deserved. We kept the changes. Let Robert think his plan was working. We even had Blake fitted for a tuxedo identical to Oliver's. Robert was practically glowing, thinking he'd orchestrated the perfect switch. The rehearsal dinner came. Robert stood up to give a speech about how love finds a way, and sometimes we need to be pushed toward our true destiny. He kept looking at Blake and winking. He talked about how the right brother would make me happy and how glad he was I'd finally seen the light. Blake sat there smirking, thinking tomorrow he'd be the groom. That's when Oliver stood up and announced we had something to share. He said we knew about Robert's attempts to switch the brothers. We knew about the vendor calls, the paperwork changes, all of it. Oliver pulled out printed emails from every vendor confirming Robert's interference. Then I stood up and said, since Robert loved Blake so much and thought he was such a catch, we had a surprise. Full story on channel, link below.